I was 7 months pregnant when I watched my husband smile at another woman like I no longer existed. The glass window of the restaurant reflected my face back at me, pale, still, almost unrecognizable, while inside, everything was warm light and soft laughter, the kind we used to share before something shifted between us, before silence replaced the small, ordinary things that once felt like love. My hand rested on the curve of my stomach, feeling the slow, steady movement of the life we created together, and for a second, I told myself there had to be an explanation, that maybe I was wrong. That maybe I had come to the wrong place, but then Daniel reached across the table and brushed his fingers over hers, gentle, familiar, the same way he used to do with me when I was too tired to stay awake through dinner, and something inside my chest tightened so sharply I had to breathe through it. I remembered the way he used to talk about our future, the way he would kneel down and press his ear against my belly like he could already hear our child laughing, the way he promised we would be different, better, stronger than everyone else we knew, and now he was leaning in closer to her, his voice low, his smile easy, like none of that had ever mattered. The city lights blurred behind me as I stepped closer to the entrance, each step heavier than the last, like I was walking into a version of my life I hadn't agreed to, and still, I couldn't stop myself, because some part of me needed to hear it, needed to know if the man I married was still somewhere behind that polished, distant expression or if I had already lost him long before tonight. When I pushed the door open, the sound of conversation wrapped around me like nothing had changed, like I wasn't carrying the weight of something breaking in real time, and for a moment, no one noticed me, not the hostess, not the guests, not even Daniel, who laughed softly at something the woman said, her hand now resting on his arm like she belonged there, like she had every right to be close to him, and I stood there, invisible in a room full of people, wondering how something so important could disappear so quietly. Then he looked up, and our eyes met, and the warmth in his expression vanished so quickly it felt rehearsed, like he had already prepared for this moment, like he had already decided who I was to him now, and suddenly the air felt thinner, harder to breathe, as if the world had shifted just enough to remind me that love, once broken, doesn't always make a sound when it falls apart. For a second, no one spoke, and I could feel every pair of eyes in the room slowly turning toward us, drawn not by noise but by something quieter, something sharper, like tension that did not need to be announced. Daniel stood up halfway, not fully, as if he could not decide whether I deserved that much acknowledgement, and the woman beside him glanced at me with a polite confusion that felt rehearsed, her fingers still resting lightly against his sleeve, unbothered, unhurried, as if she had already been assured that I was not a threat. I swallowed, forcing my voice to stay steady even as my chest tightened, and said his name the way I used to, soft and familiar, hoping it might remind him of who we were before this moment fractured everything, but the way he looked at me now was different, distant, like I had interrupted something important rather than walked into my own life. "Emma," he said, and there was a warning in it, low and controlled, the kind he used when he wanted a situation handled quickly, quietly, without complication, and that hurt more than if he had raised his voice because it meant he had already decided how this would end. I took a step closer, my hand instinctively resting over my stomach again, grounding myself in something real, something that could not be dismissed with a look or a word, and I told him we needed to talk, that I had been trying to reach him all day, that this was not something we could pretend away. But he exhaled slowly, almost impatiently, and glanced at the woman beside him before turning back to me with a faint, controlled smile that did not reach his eyes. "This is not the place," he said, as if I were the one creating a scene, as if I had brought discomfort into a room that had already erased me, and the woman finally withdrew her hand, not out of guilt, but out of curiosity, studying me now with a quiet interest, as though trying to understand how I fit into whatever story she had been told. "Daniel," I said again, softer this time, because saying his name felt like holding on to something that was already slipping away, and for a brief second, I thought I saw hesitation flicker across his face, something human, something uncertain, but it vanished just as quickly as it came, replaced by that same composed distance. "You should go home," he said, his tone even, measured, the way you speak to someone you do not want to upset but also do not want to engage with, and the words landed heavier than anything else he could have said, because they were not angry, not emotional, just final. I felt the shift then, not in the room, not in him, but in myself, like something inside me had reached its limit and quietly stopped expecting things to make sense. And for the first time that night, I realized I was not here to understand him anymore. I was here to see clearly, to see exactly what I had been trying not to see, and as I stood there, with the low hum of conversation slowly returning around us and the soft clink of glasses filling the silence he had created, I understood that some endings do not arrive with chaos, they arrive with calm, with a single sentence that tells you exactly where you stand, and in that moment, I knew I was no longer standing beside him at all. The word home echoed in my mind like something distant and unfamiliar, as if it no longer belonged to me, and for a moment I just stood there, trying to understand how a place could disappear without moving, how a life could unravel without noise, and then the woman beside him tilted her head slightly, studying me with a softness that felt almost sympathetic, but not quite enough to matter, and she asked, quietly, "Is everything okay?" As if this were a misunderstanding, as if I were just someone who had walked into the wrong moment by accident, and I realized then that whatever Daniel had told her, it did not include the truth. I let out a breath I did not know I had been holding and looked at him again. Searching for something, anything that resembled the man who used to wait up for me with takeout when I worked late, who used to trace circles on my hand while talking about names for our baby, but all I found was distance, clean and deliberate, like a door that had already been closed long before I noticed it. "I am his wife," I said, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the words to exist between us. And the silence that followed was different this time, heavier, because it carried truth instead of confusion, and the woman's expression shifted, not into anger, not into guilt, but into something sharper, something calculating, as if she were quickly rearranging the version of reality she had been given. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he shook his head once, a small gesture meant to dismiss rather than deny, and he said, "Emma, do not do this here." But his voice carried that same controlled edge, the same quiet insistence that I should make myself smaller, more convenient, easier to ignore. My fingers curled slightly against my side as I felt a sudden, sharp pull in my lower abdomen, not pain exactly, but a warning, a reminder that I was not alone in this moment, that every word, every silence, every shift in the air mattered more now, and I steadied myself against the back of a nearby chair. The polished wood cool beneath my palm, grounding me just enough to stay present. "Do what?" I asked, my voice softer than I expected, almost calm, and that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else, because I was no longer reacting the way he anticipated, no longer pleading or raising my voice or trying to hold on to something that was already gone, and the woman slowly withdrew her hand from his arm, not dramatically, just a subtle shift, like someone stepping back from a situation that no longer felt entirely safe to stand in. "I think I should go," she said after a moment, her tone measured, her eyes flicking between us as if weighing something she could not yet name. But Daniel reached out slightly, not quite touching her, just enough to signal that he did not want her to leave, and that small gesture, that almost touch, said more than anything else he had done tonight. Something inside me settled then, not breaking, not shattering, but quieting, like a storm that had already passed, leaving only stillness behind, and I realized that this was the moment everything became clear, not because of what he said, but because of what he chose not to protect. And as I stood there, holding myself steady, breathing slowly through the weight of it all, I understood that love does not disappear all at once, it fades in decisions, in silences, in the spaces where someone stops choosing you without ever saying it out loud. The air shifted in a way that had nothing to do with sound, nothing to do with movement, but everything to do with presence, and I felt it before I saw him, a subtle change that made conversation soften and posture straighten without anyone quite realizing why. And when I turned slightly, my eyes caught on a man seated alone at a table not far from ours, older, composed, his silver hair perfectly in place and his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he did not need to prove anything to anyone in the room. He had been there the entire time, watching, not intruding, not reacting, just observing with a kind of quiet attention that felt heavier than any raised voice could ever be, and when his gaze met mine, it did not linger in curiosity or judgment. It held something else entirely, something steady, something that made the noise around me fade for just a second. Daniel noticed the shift a moment later, his expression tightening as his eyes followed mine, and I saw the exact moment recognition crossed his face, subtle but undeniable, like he had just realized this situation was no longer contained within his control, and the woman beside him straightened slightly, sensing the change even if she did not understand it, her earlier confidence replaced by a cautious stillness. The man stood slowly, not in a rush, not with urgency, but with intention, and the simple act of him rising seemed to draw the room inward, like gravity had shifted without warning, and as he adjusted his jacket with a small, practiced movement, I noticed how every detail about him spoke of precision, of a life where nothing was accidental, not even silence. He began to walk toward us, each step measured, unhurried, and yet there was something in the way people subtly moved aside without being asked, something in the way the staff suddenly became more attentive without looking directly at him, that told me this was not just another guest, not just another presence passing through the room. Daniel's hand dropped from where it had hovered near the woman, his posture changing almost imperceptibly as he straightened, his earlier composure now edged with something else, something closer to awareness, and for the first time that night, I saw uncertainty in him, not loud, not obvious, but there, flickering beneath the surface he had worked so carefully to maintain. The man stopped just a few feet away, close enough that I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the calm steadiness in them, and when he spoke, his voice was low, even, carrying just enough to be heard without needing to demand attention, and yet every word seemed to settle into the space around us with quiet authority. "I believe," he said, glancing briefly at Daniel before his gaze returned to me, "that no woman in your condition should be made to stand while others remain comfortably seated," and there was no accusation in his tone, no anger, just a statement so simple and so precise that it left no room for dismissal, and for a moment, no one responded, not Daniel, not the woman, not even me, because what he had done was not intervene with force or volume, but with something far more difficult to ignore. He had acknowledged me, fully, without hesitation, without question, and in doing so, he had shifted the balance of the entire room. A chair was pulled out beside me before I could even process it, the staff moving quickly now, attentive in a way they had not been seconds ago, and I felt my knees weaken slightly as I lowered myself into the seat, my hand still resting protectively over my stomach, my breath finally steadying after what felt like hours of holding it in, and when I looked back up, the man was still standing there, calm, composed, his presence unwavering, as if he had simply corrected something that should never have been allowed to happen in the first place, and in that moment, I understood something I had not known before, that power does not always arrive loudly, sometimes it arrives quietly, and when it does, everything else has no choice but to adjust. No one spoke immediately after he finished, and the silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt controlled, like something had been placed carefully into the center of the room and everyone was waiting to see who would dare to move it. Daniel cleared his throat softly, the sound small but noticeable in the stillness, and he straightened his jacket as if that simple motion could restore the balance he had just lost, but it did not, because for the first time that night, he was no longer the one setting the tone. "There is no need to involve yourself," Daniel said, his voice measured, polite, but carrying a tightness that had not been there before, and the older man turned his gaze toward him slowly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just attentive in a way that made every word feel weighed before it was spoken. "Involvement," he repeated quietly, as if considering the word itself, and then his eyes shifted briefly toward me again, acknowledging my presence not as an interruption but as the center of what mattered, is sometimes necessary when respect is absent, and the simplicity of the sentence settled heavier than anything louder could have. The woman beside Daniel shifted her weight subtly, her earlier composure now edged with uncertainty, her fingers clasping together lightly as she glanced between them, as if realizing she had stepped into something far more complex than she had anticipated. I sat still, my hands resting gently over my stomach, feeling the steady reassurance of movement beneath my palm, and for the first time since I had walked into the restaurant, I was not trying to hold myself together, I simply was, present, grounded, seen. Daniel exhaled again, slower this time, and forced a small smile that did not quite settle naturally. "This is a private matter," he added, as if drawing a line he hoped would still hold, but the older man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without yielding to it, and when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, almost conversational, yet unmistakably firm. "Private matters," he said, "do not excuse public disregard. and there was something final in the way he said it, something that left no space for reinterpretation. A server approached quietly, placing a glass of water in front of me without being asked. The condensation cool against my fingertips as I wrapped my hand around it, and I realized how small gestures, when given at the right moment, could feel like something much larger, like dignity being returned piece by piece. Daniel's gaze flickered briefly to the glass, then back to me, and for a moment, I saw something in his expression that I could not quite name, not regret, not apology, but awareness, the kind that comes when control slips just enough to reveal what has been avoided. The older man stepped slightly to the side then, not retreating, but creating space, his presence still anchoring the moment without overwhelming it, and as he did, the entire dynamic shifted again, not into conflict, but into clarity, like a truth that had finally been allowed to exist without being pushed aside. I lifted my eyes to meet his, and there was no question in them, no demand, just a quiet assurance that I did not need to defend my place, that I did not need to prove what should have already been understood. And in that moment, I felt something settle deep within me, not because the situation had been resolved, but because for the first time that night, I was no longer standing alone inside it. Daniel's composure did not break, but it shifted, the kind of subtle fracture that only becomes visible when something stronger presses against it, and he let out a slow breath before reaching for the back of his chair as if grounding himself in something familiar, something that had always responded to his control, yet tonight it did not seem to respond the same way. "Emma," he said again, softer now. But there was something new in his tone, not authority, not dismissal, something closer to caution, as if he were recalibrating in real time, trying to decide which version of himself would serve him best in this moment, and for the first time, I did not feel pulled toward that voice, did not feel the instinct to meet him halfway or soften what he had already made clear. The woman beside him stepped back fully this time, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful distance, her gaze no longer fixed on him but shifting toward the older man, studying him with quiet recognition that seemed to arrive all at once, and whatever she understood in that moment made her straighten slightly, as if she had just realized the rules of the room had changed without warning. The older man remained composed, his hands resting lightly at his sides, his attention steady but not intrusive, and there was something about the way he held himself that made everything else feel smaller, less urgent, like the tension that had filled the space before him no longer had permission to dominate it. I lifted the glass of water to my lips, the coolness grounding me further, each breath coming easier now, and as I set it back down, I realized my hands were no longer shaking, that the storm I had carried into this room had begun to settle not because anything had been fixed, but because something had finally been seen. "You should leave," Daniel said then, but this time the words did not land the same way, they did not carry weight, they felt like an echo of something that no longer applied. And I met his gaze without flinching, without searching, simply holding it long enough for him to understand that I had heard him and chosen differently. "No," I said quietly, and the word surprised even me, not in its sound, but in its certainty, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was clarifying, like a line had been drawn not between us, but within me. The older man's gaze flickered toward me for just a moment, not approving, not guiding, simply acknowledging, and that small recognition felt steadier than anything I had reached for earlier that night. Daniel's jaw tightened again, and he glanced briefly around the room, as if measuring how much attention this moment had gathered, how much of it he could still control, but control had already shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to expose what had been hidden beneath it. "This is unnecessary," he said, quieter now, almost to himself, and the older man inclined his head slightly, as if considering that statement with the same patience he had given everything else, before responding in a tone that remained calm, almost reflective. "What is unnecessary," he said, "is forgetting what matters when it is right in front of you," and the words did not accuse, they revealed, and for a brief second, Daniel's expression changed again, something uncertain passing through it before he looked away, breaking the connection first. I sat there, feeling the weight of everything that had been said and everything that had not, and I understood then that this moment was not about winning, not about proving anything to him or anyone else in the room, it was about recognizing what I deserved and no longer negotiating it away. And as I rested my hand gently over my stomach again, feeling that quiet, steady presence beneath my palm, I realized that some endings do not need to be forced, they simply arrive when you finally stop pretending they have not already begun. Daniel did not sit back down, and that alone said more than anything he had tried to control earlier, because for the first time, he no longer looked comfortable in a place that had always responded to him with ease, and I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the quiet shifting of decisions he had not expected to make tonight, as if he were trying to find a version of this moment where he still held the advantage. The woman beside him finally stepped away completely, her chair left slightly angled behind her, and she picked up her purse with a careful motion, not rushed, not embarrassed, just deliberate, like someone who had realized she was standing in the middle of something she had not been fully told about, and whatever curiosity had brought her here had already been replaced by something else, something quieter, something closer to caution. "I think I misunderstood," she said, her voice low, directed more toward Daniel than toward me, and there was no accusation in it, only distance, the kind that forms when clarity arrives too late to be comfortable. Daniel reached for words, I could see it, the way his lips parted slightly before closing again, but nothing came out, because explanations require a foundation, and whatever he had built tonight had already begun to collapse under the weight of truth. The older man remained where he was, not moving forward, not stepping back, simply present in a way that made everything else feel temporary, and I realized then that he was not here to dominate the situation. He was here to reveal it, to allow it to unfold without interference until it could no longer hide behind politeness or assumption. I shifted slightly in my seat, adjusting the way I held myself, and for the first time since I had walked through those doors, I did not feel like I was intruding on something. I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be, not because of him, not because of Daniel, but because I had finally stopped trying to make something fit that had already broken. Daniel looked at me again, really looked this time, not past me, not through me, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before, something unguarded, fleeting, like he had just realized the cost of the choices he had been treating so casually, but even that did not move me the way it once would have, because understanding arrives differently when it comes too late. "Emma," he said again, softer now, almost uncertain, and I held his gaze for a moment. Just long enough to let the silence answer for me, just long enough for him to feel what it meant when I no longer filled the space between us with forgiveness he had not earned. The room around us had settled into a strange calm, the kind that follows a shift no one fully understands but everyone can feel, and the older man finally spoke again, his voice steady, almost reflective, as if he were offering something rather than taking it away. "There are moments," he said, his eyes moving briefly, "between us, when what you choose not to protect becomes the only thing anyone remembers," and the words did not linger in the air, they settled, quiet and undeniable, and Daniel looked away again, this time not in control, but in recognition. I rested my hand over my stomach once more, feeling that small, steady reassurance beneath my palm, and I realized that this was no longer about what I had lost, it was about what I would no longer accept, and as I sat there, calm in a way I had not expected, I understood that some people do not change when they are given chances, they change when they are finally seen clearly, and by then, it is already too late to matter. The room did not return to what it had been before, even as conversations slowly resumed and glasses touched softly against polished tables, because something had shifted too deeply to be undone by normalcy, and I could feel it in the way people avoided looking directly at us now, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition that they had witnessed something that was not meant for them and yet impossible to ignore. Daniel remained standing, his posture no longer relaxed but held in place by something unseen, something heavier than pride, and for a moment I wondered if he understood it too, if he could feel the difference between control and consequence settling quietly around him. The woman who had been beside him adjusted the strap of her purse and gave him one last look, not dramatic, not emotional, just clear, and then she stepped away without another word, her heels soft against the floor as she moved toward the exit, and Daniel did not stop her this time, did not reach for her or call her back, because whatever he might have said would not have restored what had already been revealed. I watched her go, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a strange sense of distance, as if she had never really been the center of this moment at all, just a reflection of something that had already been broken long before tonight. The older man shifted slightly then, turning his attention fully toward me, and there was a quiet respect in the way he inclined his head, not as Acknowledgement of weakness, but of strength, the kind that does not need to be proven loudly to exist. You should not remain here any longer, he said gently, his voice steady, carrying none of the authority he had used before, only consideration now, and I realized that this was the first time anyone had spoken to me that night with my well-being in mind rather than their own position. I nodded slowly, the movement small but certain, and as I began to rise from the chair, I felt a brief hesitation, not doubt, but awareness, like standing at the edge of something familiar and choosing not to step back into it. Daniel moved then, just a fraction, as if he wanted to say something, to reclaim a moment that had already passed. But whatever words he searched for did not come, and the silence between us felt final in a way that required no explanation. I steadied myself as I stood, my hand once again resting over my stomach, and the simple act of standing felt different now, not fragile, not uncertain, but grounded in something I had not felt when I first walked in. The older man stepped slightly to the side, allowing space without withdrawing his presence, and as I moved past him, he spoke once more, not loudly, not for the room, just for me. Respect is not something you ask for, he said quietly, it is something you stop accepting less than, and the words stayed with me as I walked toward the door, each step lighter than the last, not because anything had been fixed, but because something inside me had finally aligned. I did not look back as I reached the exit, did not search for Daniel or wait for anything to change, because I understood now that closure does not always come from others, sometimes it comes from the moment you decide to leave without needing to be asked twice. And as the door opened and the cool night air met my skin, I realized that I had not lost everything tonight, I had simply stopped holding on to what was never meant to stay. The night air felt colder than it should have, or maybe it was just the absence of everything I had been holding on to finally settling into place, and I paused just outside the restaurant doors for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around me in a way the inside never could, my hand still resting gently over my stomach as if to remind myself that not everything had changed, that something steady and real still moved forward with me. The city lights stretched out ahead, soft and distant, and for the first time that evening, I did not feel like I was running from anything. I felt like I had simply stepped out of something that no longer belonged to me, and there was a difference in that, a quiet kind of strength that did not need to be announced to exist. I heard the door open behind me, not hurried, not abrupt, just enough to let me know I was no longer alone in that space, and when I turned slightly, the older man stepped out as well, his presence just as composed in the open air as it had been inside, untouched by the shift of environment, as if the world adjusted to him rather than the other way around. He did not move too close, did not interrupt the space I had created, he simply stood there for a moment before speaking, his voice calm, carrying the same quiet weight it had before. You handled that with more grace than most would, he said, not as a compliment meant to soften anything, but as an observation. Something measured and deliberate, and I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite relief, just something in between that felt honest. I did not feel graceful, I admitted, my voice quieter now, stripped of everything I had tried to hold together inside, and he inclined his head slightly, as if that answer made more sense than anything else I could have said. Grace is rarely felt in the moment, he replied, his gaze steady but not intrusive, it is recognized after, and there was something about the way he said it that made me pause, not because I needed reassurance, but because I realized I did not need it anymore. A car passed slowly on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across us before fading into the distance, and I adjusted my coat slightly around me, the fabric settling over my shoulders like something grounding, something that belonged to me in a way the rest of the night had not. Thank you, I said after a moment, not just for what he had done, but for what he had allowed me to see, and he gave a small nod, accepting the words without expanding them into something larger. Take care of yourself, he said simply, and there was no hidden meaning behind it, no expectation, just a statement that stood on its own, and I realized that was what made it matter. I nodded once in return, my hand still resting over the quiet, steady movement beneath it, and as I turned to walk toward the street, I did not feel the need to look back, not for him, not for Daniel, not for anything that had stayed behind those doors. Because I understood now that closure does not always come with answers, sometimes it comes with clarity, with the moment you recognize that what you were holding on to no longer deserves your grip, and as I stepped forward into the night, the city unfolding ahead of me in quiet lights and open space, I realized something that felt both simple and profound at the same time. He did not lose me because of another woman, he lost me because he forgot that love, like respect, is something you protect before it ever has the chance to leave.